They say the past doesn't knock, it rings at dinner. Mine did. One ordinary evening, the voice on the line belonged to my ex's oldest friend, a man I hadn't spoken to in years. He said one clear thing that pulled a hidden thread in me, and the life I'd carefully folded began to unfold, neat corner by neat corner. Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Now, before I begin, tell me, where are you watching from? I'd love to know which cities and towns are joining me for this memory that stayed with me for years. I was standing at the sink, palm resting on a warm plate, steam fogging the window above the faucet. Outside, the streetlight pooled honey yellow on the quiet road, the way it always does after dinner on our block. The phone lit up with a name I almost didn't recognize until memory supplied the rest. Nate, short for Nathaniel, my ex-husband's college roommate, the best man at our wedding, the friend who had always smiled at me like he was taking a mental picture of the moment. Years had passed. Life had shuffled and reshuffled. I let the phone buzz twice, maybe 3 times, before I answered. He didn't bother with a long preface. "Hello, Claire. It's Nate. I know it's out of the blue. I just needed to tell you something I should have said a long time ago." That was it. No apology big enough to wear as armor. No rambling justification. His voice had the steadiness of a person who had practiced the line and was now brave enough to say it aloud. My mouth went dry the way it does when thunderstorms keep their distance, but the air still tastes like metal. I leaned my hip into the counter and turned off the water. "You picked an interesting time to be brave," I said, too gently to be a jab. Silence stretched until it felt like a small room we had to share. I could hear his breath and the faint sound of traffic wherever he was, that distant shush of tires on pavement that makes you think of traveling even while you're standing still. "I don't want anything from you," he said. "I promise. I just want you to have the truth." It was a strange gift to be offered at 8:30 on a Thursday, between rinsing dishes and putting the kettle on. Truth. I thought of how my ex and I had ended. Slow erosion, then a sudden cliff. In the years since, I had become tidy with my feelings, labeled boxes on a shelf. This call walked right into the storage room and flipped on the light. "Where are you?" I asked, not sure why it mattered. He laughed softly, as if the answer might make me less cautious. In his laugh I heard all the afternoons he used to sit at our kitchen table, tapping a beat on the wood while my ex told stories that were 60% memory and 40% performance. "I'm near the river," he said. "Just parked." I couldn't say this from my apartment. It felt like the walls would hold me to every word. "What is it you think I need to hear?" The words came out steadier than I felt. He took a breath that sounded like it gathered a decade. "I should have stood up for you." When things were being said, when he was rewriting the end, I let it happen. I watched you carry blame that wasn't yours because it kept the peace. His voice didn't tremble, but something in it softened. "I was cowardly, and I'm sorry." Heat rose behind my eyes, sudden and embarrassing. I pressed the heel of my hand there and blinked at the window, where the streetlight had blurred into a milky halo. That winter comes back to me like wind under a door. The hushed arguments, the careful steps, the fatigue that makes you grip the rail when you go downstairs. Maybe I had been waiting for someone else to remember it the way I did. "I don't know what to do with this," I admitted. My voice sounded small, but honest. He said, "You don't have to do anything." I was wrong to be quiet. "I can't fix what happened between you two, but I can put my name on the truth." He paused. "And there's something else I kept to myself because it felt complicated. I'm not going to complicate your life, Claire, but I'm done pretending it didn't exist." A car rolled past, a single headlight out, as if even it was winking at secrets. I could feel my pulse in my palm where it rested on the counter. We are not young anymore, I thought. We don't have forever to say the things that matter, and yet we've waited as if the right words needed ripening on some high branch. What else? I asked. The kettle clicked on behind me, a reflex of comfort. I'm listening. He exhaled a quiet, braced breath that sounded like the moment before you step from a curb into the crosswalk. Then he said the words that would color everything that came after, a simple confession that felt like opening a window in a long-closed room. And that's when the line went very still, and I realized the night had just shifted under my feet. I stayed quiet for a long moment, holding the phone to my ear, like it was a lifeline. The kettle behind me whistled softly, but I couldn't bring myself to turn it off. Nate's words hung in the air, heavier than steam, heavier than the quiet night outside. I don't know what to say, I finally admitted. My voice cracked in a way I hadn't heard in years. I'd become practiced at keeping my tone calm, polite, measured. But this stripped me back to something raw. You don't have to say anything, you replied. I couldn't go another year with you not knowing. His voice wasn't polished. It wasn't the confident tone I remembered from our younger years, when he always seemed to have the right words to fill a room. Now it was different. He sounded like a man laying down a burden he carried too long. I walked into the living room, phone pressed to my ear, leaving the light of the kitchen behind. The room was dim, shadows of the lamplight stretching across the carpet. I sat on the couch, curling my knees beneath me like I used to when I needed comfort. Nate, I said slowly, you were his friend. His best friend. Why now? There was a pause, and then a sigh. Because I finally realized how much it cost you. And because he hesitated, I've never stopped thinking about the way you looked at me that night. I frowned, confused. What night? The night you left. You don't remember. You were packing your car, your hands shaking, and you turned to me when he slammed the door behind him. For a second, you looked at me like he wanted me to stop you. Like you needed someone to tell you that you weren't crazy, that you weren't wrong. And I just stood there. I pressed a hand to my chest, as if that could steady my racing heart. I did remember, though I hadn't thought of it in years. That night was burned into me. The sound of a suitcase zipper, the dull thud of the car trunk, the cold air of a March evening biting at my cheeks. And yes, there had been a moment when I turned, and he had been standing there, watching, silent. I thought you didn't care, I whispered. I cared too much, he said quietly. That was the problem. I didn't want to make it worse for you. I didn't want him to think. His words drifted away, unfinished. For the first time in years, I let myself wonder what he had been thinking then. What it must have been like for him to watch, caught between loyalty to his oldest friend and compassion for the woman leaving that friend behind. The kettle clicked off on its own, silence settling in again. I realized my hands were trembling, and I gripped the edge of the blanket on the couch to steady them. I've built a whole life since then, I murmured. I don't know what you expect me to do with this now. I expect nothing, he said simply. I just wanted you to know you weren't wrong, and that you weren't alone, even if it looked that way. His words were careful, but they carried something underneath, something I couldn't name yet. I closed my eyes, leaning back into the cushions. For years, I had told myself the story the way my ex had wanted it told, like a script rehearsed until it sounded true. But hearing Nate's voice now, I felt the script unraveling, thread by thread. You've shaken me, I admitted, with a weak laugh. I didn't think there was anything left in the past that could do that. His answer came softly. Then maybe it's time to see the past differently. The line went quiet again, except for the faint sound of wind where he sat in his car by the river. And I knew, with a strange certainty, that this conversation was only the beginning. I didn't sleep much that night. The house felt both familiar and strange, as though Nate's words had shifted its foundation without moving a single brick. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying his voice in my mind. It wasn't just what he had said. It was the way he had said it, the weight in his tone, the honesty that felt almost foreign after years of silence. The next morning, I made my coffee stronger than usual. The mug warmed my hands as I stood by the window, watching the neighbors head off to work, their lives untouched by the tremors running through mine. A part of me wondered if I should call him back. Another part whispered that maybe I should leave it alone. But curiosity and something deeper, a need for clarity, won out. By noon, I found myself dialing his number. He answered on the second ring, his voice steady but edged with surprise. "Claire?" "I couldn't just leave things where we left them," I said, my throat tight. "You told me to see the past differently." "Well, help me do that. Because right now all I see is what I lost." There was a pause. I could picture him sitting there, probably in that same car by the river. "Then maybe you need to hear what I saw," he said at last. And so he began to talk. He told me about the years when he watched my marriage crack, about the arguments he overheard, the way he noticed me retreating into myself. "I used to think you were the strongest person I knew," he said, "but then I realized strength doesn't mean carrying everything alone. It means knowing when you deserve better." I swallowed hard. His words felt like truth I had long suspected, but never let myself embrace. "Why didn't you say any of this back then?" "Because I was a coward," he admitted. "And because I thought if I said too much, I'd lose both of you. But in the end, I lost you anyway." Something in me cracked at that. I hadn't realized until that moment how much I had wanted anyone, to simply acknowledge that I wasn't crazy. That what I endured wasn't all in my head. Tears slipped down my cheeks, silent and uninvited. "I wish you had said something," I whispered. "I know," he replied softly, "and I'll carry that regret. But I can say it now, and I can promise you this, you were worth standing up for. You always were." We talked for what felt like hours, weaving between memories and silences, between confessions and laughter that surprised me with its ease. It was like dusting off an old book and finding that the words still mattered, even after years of neglect. By the time we said goodbye, the sun had slipped low in the sky. My heart felt lighter, but also unsettled, like a door had been opened, and I wasn't sure what might walk through it next. As I sat there in the quiet, I realized that the story of my past wasn't finished after all. And for the first time in years, I wondered if maybe, just maybe, the next chapter of my life wasn't meant to be written alone. The following days carried a quiet electricity, like the hush before a storm you aren't sure will ever arrive. I went about my routines, grocery shopping, folding laundry, tending to the little garden on the porch, but everything seemed touched by an invisible thread pulling me back to that call, to Nate's words that still lingered in my chest. On the third evening, just as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with that peculiar orange pink I've always loved, my phone rang again. His name lit up the screen, and this time I didn't hesitate. "Claire," he said, his voice gentler than I remembered it could be. "I've been thinking about what you said, that all you could see was what you lost. I want to show you something different. Can we meet?" For a moment, the old fear tugged at me, fear of stirring the past, fear of giving meaning to something that might dissolve once daylight touched it. But beneath that fear was curiosity and a fragile hope I hadn't felt in years. "All right," I said. We met at a small cafe by the river, the kind with chipped mugs and a quiet corner where no one rushed you to leave. When I walked in, he was already there, standing to greet me, his eyes carrying the same steady warmth I'd once overlooked. Time had touched him too. Lines etched at the corners of his mouth, hair graying at the temples, but none of it diminished him. If anything, it made his presence more real, more grounded. We talked for hours, and it wasn't just about the past anymore. He asked about my work, my children, the little victories and setbacks that make up ordinary life. And in return, he told me about his own stumbles and lessons, about the ways he'd grown since those days of silence. It was startlingly simple, the way conversation flowed, as though the years between us had only been a pause, not an ending. At one point, I asked the question that had been circling me since his first call. Why tell me all this now? After so long? He looked at me, and his answer was steady, unadorned. Because we don't get forever, Claire. And I don't want to leave this world without you knowing that you mattered more to me than I ever let on. Not in some grand, complicated way, but in the truest way. You were the one I believed in, even when I didn't say it. The words sank deep, not as a burden, but as a release. I felt something loosen inside me, a knot I hadn't realized was still tied. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying the weight of unanswered questions alone. When we finally left the cafe, the river shimmered with reflections of streetlights, the air cool against our faces. We walked slowly, side by side, not touching, not rushing, just breathing in the quiet honesty of the night. And I realized then that this was what I had been searching for, not a return to what once was, but the possibility of seeing my life, my story, through a new lens. As we reached the corner where we'd part, Nate paused. "Whatever comes next," he said, "I'm grateful you answered that call." I nodded, my throat too full for words, because in that moment I understood. The past doesn't always return to haunt us. Sometimes it returns to heal us. And his words, the ones that had left me breathless, would now carry me forward, not as a shadow of what was lost, but as a light toward what might still be found.